Thank you very much. Okay, I'm still glad to welcome you to this meeting of the British Association of Local History. It's our first in-person meeting for 3 years. It's really great to be actually with real people again, and I'm very glad to welcome you all, and I look forward very much to all the things that we're going to do today, some of which will be in person, and of course there are also people on screen, and we're very glad to welcome them as well. And I think it's easy for me to say this because how successful the BALH has been during lockdown. Since I've had nothing to do with it except admire it. It's absolutely fantastic what they've managed to do online. All these webinars, these lectures, these 10-minute talks. It's been really dynamic, and I think all those who are involved deserve our thanks for the really successful lockdown period. We've learnt a lot, and we've managed to enjoy each other's company on screen. It's been really great. Thank you to all those, and they know who they are, who've made this possible. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Mark Forrest, who's sitting quietly there. I'm particularly glad to introduce Mark because many years ago he was my postgraduate student. And as you know, you learn, if you're a supervisor, you learn a lot from your postgraduate students. Now, I'm a historian of London, so I'm an urban historian, but Mark was a student at Royal Holloway, and he wanted to do manorial history. And for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, he ended up being my postgraduate student. So, of course, I learned a lot from Mark because he took me into the countryside. He made me look at manorial records. It really was Mark who first introduced me to manorial records, and that has been really Mark's career since. He's a real expert on manorial records, and he started his work with the manorial records of Chertsey Abbey and in Middlesex and Surrey. He then worked for the Manorial Documents Register, which many of you, I'm sure, have used and know about, but that was being revised. And this year sees the completion of that revision of the Manorial Documents Register, which Mark was really in at the beginning, weren't you? I mean, so in a sense, he's partly responsible for this tremendous revision. So if you're interested in local areas, do look at the Manorial Documents Register online in the National Archives to see whether your particular area has some manorial records surviving, because they turn up in unexpected places, not just your local record office. Anyway, Mark became and is an expert on manorial records. He was the archivist at the Dorset Record Office. He's now a freelance archivist, but he's also just written a book for the BALH about manorial records in the later period, 1500 to 1700. But I've read that book, and actually it tells you a great deal about manorial records right through the period, not just in that particular segment of time. So I'm really glad that Mark is willing to talk to us this morning. I look forward very much to hearing what he has to say. Thank you, Mark, for coming.
Well, thanks, Caroline. I hope I'll get a few urban manners in here to interest you too. Okay. In 1791, Reverend John Collinson, writing his History of Somerset, found a curious custom on the manor of Taunton. He found that when a man died holding land from the lord of the manor, his wife would hold it during her widowhood. And if he only had one son, then that son would be next in line to inherit. But if he had more than one son, then it was the manorial custom that determined it was the youngest son who would inherit as his heir. When Reverend Collinson, he was quite familiar with manors, and he spends much of his 3-volume History of Somerset describing them, and nevertheless he encountered dozens of customs that he found curious. Some aspects of Somerset manors and their customs were strange and unusual and worthy of comment, because he couldn't explain their origins. Although Reverend Collinson lived in an age when the manor was still part of current estate administration, traces of their medieval origins remained. And when local historians look at post-medieval manorial documents, they too are seeing a system of estate management and local government that was already centuries old, that had grown organically and developed locally. These maps have been subject to some standardisation through the introduction of stewards' manuals, but it's still common to find some aspect of life on the manor that would differ from that of its neighbours. Consequently, it's easiest to explain manorial customs, courts and documents through the development of general themes commonly applied on most manors rather than an absolute rule that all manors followed, because there's always going to be an exception. So this talk's in three parts. First, I'll discuss a small fraction of what interests me about manorial documents. First, offering a general introduction to rural manors, exploring key themes, the customs of the manor, the court baron, that is the court that was held on every manor, which managed common assets and administered copyhold tenancies. Then I'll look at manors with some urban element. And second court, the court leet, which was held on some manors and was particularly important in towns. Finally, I'll demonstrate through two case studies how manorial documents may be used by local historians in broader research, and particularly their use in charting environmental change. So I hope there'll be something of interest to those who've already used manorial documents and in their research, and also to those who are coming at them as a new resource. Let's check this works. Yes. First, let's look at Chalbury. It's a Dorset manor on the Earl of Shaftesbury's estate. Chalbury had been held by several different gentry families during the Middle Ages and acquired by the first Earl of Shaftesbury in the mid-16th century. Here it's shown on William Palmer's map of 1658. Chalbury displays many of the features found on rural manors. On the extreme left, that's your left, not mine, you find there's a common depicted in green with trees. Moving towards the centre, there are areas of wood pasture and enclosed pasture in turquoise. In the centre, there are woods, also shown in green with trees. And on the right are strips of arable in large open fields, marked in yellow, orange and blue. And on the far right is the manor's meadow in a separate box. Chalbury looks like many... it's better down. Chalbury looks like many Dorset manors, and almost all the land contained within the boundary as a single block. Only the meadow is detached about 2 miles away. The arable is still managed in open fields in the 17th century and wouldn't be enclosed for another 100 years. There might be other assets on the manor. There might be moors, mills, markets and dovecots, fishing rights or fenland. But here we see the key components, all of which are found on different proportions on the great majority of manors. Much of the land was managed in common. Flocks of sheep belonging to the different tenants were folded together on commons or downs and brought into the fields after harvest. The owners of pigs released them together in the woods in the autumn. Open or common fields were sown with crops in an agreed rotation, and the meadows were only divided once they were ready to be mown. As long as these resources were worked in common, it was necessary to follow a range of customs, which might include things like the date at which the sheep could be released into the fields after gleaning, who could take firewood from the woods and hedgerows, who allocated trees to be felled for repairs, how disputes relating to encroachment in the open fields between the neighbouring strips were resolved, who was obliged to act as a haywood at harvest time, or a reeve who administered the Lord's general rents and collected in those dues from the tenants. These are jobs which were often rotated around specific groups of holdings. The customs that determined this developed over centuries, and they continued to develop gradually as long as there were common resources to manage, and as long as the fiction was maintained that they were set in stone and had been adhered to time out of mind. So the customs of the manor were interpreted through the Manor Court, known as a court baron, and it's this court that defined the manor. The court baron was the Lord's court, and it was by the right to hold this court that the manor came to be defined. Here, on the left, is a typical court roll from Monkton up Wimborne, just a few miles north of Chelbury, from 1658. The heading gives the date of the court and the name of the steward. This is followed by the names of the tenants, the homage, the tenants in attendance, and notes of those who are absent, and the tenants who were selected to serve as jurors within the court. Then come the presentments, stating some of the customary responsibilities of the tenants, that the common is properly hedged, that ducks and geese should be kept out of the Lord's orchards, that pigs should have their noses ringed when they're released in the woods. Other presentments relate to the tenants' customary entitlements, that they were allowed windfalls from trees as firewood. Some further presentments state events that had occurred, that Richard Jervis had built a house on the common and John Etheridge had built a stable, and both of them paid retrospective fines to the Lord for the right to do so. Finally, we have presentments that note the responsibilities of the Lord of the manor. In this court, it states that he should provide £1 for stray animals. The two longest presentments relate to the administration of copyhold land, managing tenancies and admitting new tenants. This roll is in English. It was written in the 1650s during the Commonwealth. Otherwise, official records of the courts were recorded in Latin until 1733. Commonwealth documents, like this one, are a good way for researchers new to manorial records to get an understanding of the nature of documents before tackling anything in Latin, and they also give a whole decade where you can look at the Manor Court as it functions with all the records in English. And it's also worth noting that in the southwest, and I think probably elsewhere as well, from about 1600, once the court clerk had recorded the heading, official appointments and property transfers in Latin, then English was used to record many of the customs, presentments and proclamations that were brought before the court. So the bulk of the business in many courts is accessible in English and to those without a knowledge of Latin. Many courts, but not all. Other documents are much more likely to be in English from an earlier date. Surveys, rentals, stewards' papers and perambulations were often recorded in English from the mid-16th century, and almost always from the mid-17th century. So from the Reformation onwards, there's an increasing range of documents in English in every county, and from around 1600, the majority of documents are in English. So if you think back to that court at Monkton up Wimborne, the two longest presentments related to the admission of new tenants to copyhold tenancies. And copyhold tenancy was a form of landholding peculiar to the manor. It was abolished exactly 100 years ago in 1922, and it developed out of the ancient servile customary tenures that had been the norm in the early medieval period. The first known copy was granted in Dorset, in the manor of Newland, in 1307. And as a form of tenancy, it had become recognisable nationally by around 1500. Until its abolition by Act of Parliament in 1922, a large amount of land was held by copyhold tenants, and its gradual replacement by leasehold and freehold was one of the most important changes to life in many rural areas. So how did copyhold tenure work? Well, a tenant came to court, swore fealty or allegiance to the lord of the manor, and paid a fine. Then he received from the hands of the lord through the steward, his holding by copy of court roll and by the customs of the manor. The details of the tenancy were recorded in the court roll, and the tenants received a copy, like this one, from Sturminster Newton. In Dorset and elsewhere, tenants often held their copyholds for terms of lives, usually 3 lives, rather than for a term of years. They had the right to pay a fine to add a new life when the incumbent tenant died or the property passed on. So they could always top up the number of lives on the copyhold to maintain it at 3. So it was a relatively secure form of tenure. And it couldn't usually be terminated unless the tenant allowed it to lapse. Now this all sounds fairly straightforward, but the devil's in the detail. Because copyhold was a customary tenure, it was governed by the customs of the manor. Adjacent manors might have different customs, perhaps relating to the rights of widows, or as we saw in Somerset, who could inherit, and when death duties or heriots were payable. These were set out in the customs of the manor, and the copyhold agreements bound the tenants and the lord alike to adhere to them. Overall, copyhold tenants often had more security, lower rents, and greater access to communal assets than did leaseholders, and more obligations and more restrictions than freeholders. A lord might sell copyholds to his tenants as a freehold to raise capital, and this was usually quite advantageous to the tenant. Or he could exchange them for leaseholds to reduce his own administration, and this was usually not so advantageous to the tenants. But once converted, they could never be changed back again, and almost no new copyhold was created after the early 16th century. So there's a diminishing pool. For local historians, as well as social and economic historians, the transition from copyhold to leasehold and freehold and the effect that this had on the land market, on tenant security, customary rights, local office holding and agricultural production cast light on the development of the whole rural economy and the community at large. Now, not all manors were like these little Dorset manors at Chalbury and Monkton up Wimble. Elsewhere, and particularly in the north of England and in Wales, manors could be very large indeed, and they could encompass several settlements. Here's Wakefield Manor in Yorkshire, for which many of the court rolls have been published in the Wakefield Court Rolls series by the Yorkshire Archaeological and Historical Society. Wakefield was a massive manor. It covered 150 square miles of the West Riding. And in addition to Wakefield, it included several large towns, such as Brighouse and Halifax. It was split into 2 main blocks of land separated by other manors, and it had several detached parts, and the whole manor was so large that it had to be divided into smaller administrative areas called graveships. These large manors were considerably more complex to administer than their Dorset counterparts, but they shared key components: common lands, customary rights, copyhold tenancies, and a manor court, that's a court baron, which resolved disputes, appointed officers, and issued new tenancies. So local historians, looking at these manors and using the records of the court baron and the maps, surveys, rentals, and other papers created by the steward for his day-to-day administration, local historians can ask questions like, who were the manorial officers and jurors? Were they the same people who were the overseers of the poor and the church wardens? We might ask when the open fields were enclosed, and did that enclosure coincide with copyhold being converted to leasehold or freehold? Was that before or after enclosure? Or perhaps we could ask how frequently the court sat, how many people attended each session, what presentments did the stewards and the tenant bring before the court, and did that change over time? Did the courts become less frequent as time progressed, and did the nature of the presentments that people brought to the courts change from one century to the next? It's from answers to these questions that we get an insight into the development of rural communities across the country. But rural manors were not the only manors. The court baron was also held in urban areas, and copyhold tenure might be for shops or townhouses, as well as for agricultural land. A manorial administration might be just as important in a town as in the countryside. In towns, a second court, called a court leet, often played a more significant role than the court baron. The court leet was held on many rural manors, but it's in urban areas that it had its most important role in town government. Court leet was a royal court. It was franchised to some larger manors, and the court appointed constables, administered fines for minor personal offences such as brawls and verbal abuse, and it dealt with regulatory issues such as weights and measures, street cleaning or chimney maintenance. While many historians have worked on rural manors, recently more attention has been paid to urban manors and how the manor interacted with other institutions in urban development. The most common way for an urban manor to develop was when a lord was granted the right to hold a market. The market grew, permanent retail shops and craftsmen's workshops were established, and the manor then had to regulate an urban as well as a rural environment. The most extreme example is the manor of Manchester, here, where as the market grew, the manorial administration became ever more complicated. New officers were appointed, and the Manor Court regulated the town's growing commercial centre. The court records and accounts of Manchester Manor, like those for Wakefield, have been published and make a good starting point for local historians to see a wide range, a really wide range, of responsibilities undertaken by an urban manorial administration. This page, on my left, your right, from the court held in 1735, shows the manor's court leet, held by a steward on behalf of the lord of the manor in front of a jury. It appoints a reeve, a constable, or several constables, rent collectors, rent assessors, overseers of the sale of corn, fish and meat in different parts of the town, and assessors of the quality of leather, regulators of beer and ale, scavengers to clear the streets, as well as dog muzzlers, and officers to uphold local bylaws. In 1735, Manchester Court Leet appointed 126 officers to serve for the coming year. The manor issued licences to stallholders and charged tolls. Like many other urban manors, Manchester retained medieval rights of monopoly for grinding corn and drying malt. And the manor had leased the right to grind corn and the mill to Manchester Grammar School. So in the 18th century, Manchester Grammar School holds the right to grind all the corn within Manchester, and its strict enforcement of this monopoly led to serious riots in 1757. The following year, a local Act of Parliament had to be passed to remove the monopoly, and the school was compensated with an exemption from all local rates and taxes. So Manchester's manorial infrastructure grew organically over several centuries. The Court Leet created a new regulatory office whenever need arose and struggled to manage the growing town. Gradually, the inhabitants grew unhappy with the creaking administration of the Court Leet, and in 1846, only 7 years before Manchester achieved city status, the manor was sold by the Moseley family to the borough for £200,000. It was £200,000 in 1846. And this enormous sum recognised the manor's economic importance and the profits that could be made from the rents, tolls and market regulations that it retained. As part of the role of Manchester Court Leet, in addition to regulating markets and administering bylaws, was the prosecution of minor acts of criminal behaviour. Top right. Here, in 1651, we see Manchester Court imposing fines of 2 shillings on the participants of a fight in which blood was drawn, and 3 inhabitants each fined 5 shillings for public drunkenness. These were not necessarily particularly serious offences, and they represent the court leet's role in resolving disputes that might escalate, as well as dealing with the preservation of public morality. Similar presentments were made at the court leets in much smaller towns and villages. In the Dorset town of Gillingham in 1652, Anne Jeanes describes a common scold and disturber of her neighbours, was sentenced to be washed in the tumbrel, a device which, like the town stocks and pillory, was maintained as part of the manorial infrastructure specifically for the public humiliation of offenders. Also at Gillingham, in 1635, we find Andrew Hoskins, reported for organising a spectacle of bull and bear baiting, activities that had been prescribed in the Book of Sports 2 years previously. This charge was too serious to be dealt with by the court leet, and it was referred upwards to the Justice of the Peace. But it demonstrates the concerns of the constable, who was part of that process of moving people up through the court leet and the ladder of royal courts. The prosecution of these types of cases at the court leet varied over time. In Dorset, we find those relating to violent conflict seem to have been fairly constant through the 16th century and the 17th century, and tailed off in the 18th century, while those relating to public morality appear to have peaked in the mid-17th century. Now, Manchester was exceptional in size and Gillingham quite small. But the tension that existed between the growing commercial sector and the manorial administration was found in many towns. Chippenham, which is more or less in between, well, it's not as small as Gillingham, and it's a lot smaller than Manchester. In Wiltshire, the relationship between the manor and borough of Chippenham and the surrounding manors highlights some of the areas in which manorial administrations might become involved in a growing town even when the borough held its own courts. The Lord of Chippenham Manor was granted a market charter in 1205, and its status was confirmed in 1554 when a new charter was issued and market rights passed to the borough, together with most of the urban properties. But this wasn't a clean break. Marking the boundaries of the borough as they were set out in 1554 and remained until 1833 on this Ordnance Survey map, shows just how much of the developing town lay outside the borough and within the adjacent manors. Chippenham Manor also continued to hold several shops and houses within the borough's borders. It was responsible for the maintenance of half the town bridge, owned parts of the roads and verges, and on occupied land within the borough that were technically part of the manorial commons and wastes. So Chippenham Manor's rights to unenclosed pieces of land, verges and even pavements caused constant irritation. The steward charged easements for every conceivable encroachment. He charged 5 shillings per year for each grille in pavement over a basement window. And the Anglo-Swiss company, which produced condensed milk in a large factory, had to pay 10 shillings a year for the tunnel that passed under the street, linking the factory with the storehouses, because the street was part of the manor. More serious was a protracted dispute with the General Post Office over charging rents for telegraph poles erecting on verges, which were technically part of the manorial waste. And this was eventually taken to the Court of Chancery and not resolved until after 2 or 3 decades of wrangling between the two sides, resolved in favour of the Post Office. So Chippenham Manor provided areas for expansion to the northwest of the borough and sought to exploit the town financially. But Monkton Manor provided the land for expansion to the southeast. As the town developed during the 19th century, more and more houses were built extending into what had once been Monkton's open fields. The residents of these new houses paid their rents to the Lord of the Manor and attended his court leet rather than the borough court. The court leet appointed a constable and a tithing man, who were responsible for public order. A breadweier, as some retail transactions took place within the suburban development. And a hayward, because the manor still had large areas of arable and meadow to be looked after. Court was clearly important to the tenants. When the Lord tried to hold it less frequently in the 1840s, they objected, stating in 1851 that, and I quote, "Since this court has been discontinued to be held annually, great and serious nuisances and encroachments have been committed and continued within this manor, to the serious annoyance of the inhabitants, and an annual court appears to us to be expedient and necessary." So why was an annual court necessary in 1851? Well, Manchester Manor had been quite active in the preceding decades. For instance, it had built a new set of stocks opposite the Methodist church in 1836, and a new pump in 1851. At the court in 1887, after acknowledging the new lord of the manor, the tenants presented that there was a lack of common pound, which was the responsibility of the lord to provide, the old one having become dilapidated and useless. They presented that some trees should be planted to the north side of the river opposite the bathing house to add privacy and shelter to the bathing place. They presented a footpath and a road requires repairs and the highway board should be informed. They presented that for the protection of the public, a chain should be placed across the dipping place. I think that's an area where people did laundry. At the common slip, and the sanitary board should be informed. Then they thanked the lord of the manor for providing them with a good dinner. So even at this late date, in the 19th century, 12 or more property holders got together, they had a semi-social occasion, and these were men who liked the church more than she'd consider part of the respectable town elite. They had personal access to the steward, the sort of soft power that greased the wheels of local decision-making. They could use their influence, put direct pressure on the local highway board and on the sanitary authority. And they had common oversight over local assets, from the stocks and the pump to the bathing place. So certainly the tenants benefited from access to the court, and they used it to enhance their role in town government. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, the lords of urban and partially urban manors possessed properties that paid new, higher rents and greatly increased in value. Manorial lords like the Mosleys at Manchester and the Goldneys at Chippenham realised the economic worth of their manorial rights and exploited them for as long as they could retain that role of lord of the manor. Now, I've spent a little bit longer talking about urban manors than rural manors, because while the courtly was present in both areas, it had the opportunity to develop its functions much further in towns. But manorial documents are not just about the records of the courts. For many studies, the subordinate documents created by the steward and his officers can be just as revealing. Here we return to the Parliamentary Survey of Chertsey that we saw on the first slide. And it includes a description of the manor house, beginning, and I quote, "All that capital messuage, manor and manor house, with the site there commonly called and known by the name of Chertsey Vermont, lying and being within the parish of Chertsey in the county of Surrey. Being an old house, part brick and part wood, covered with tiles, consisting of a hall, a parlour, a kitchen, a buttery, a brew house, a milk house, and a larder, all below stairs, and 7 rooms above stairs." Now, this description continues to recount the various outbuildings in similar detail and their uses before setting out the terms and conditions of the lease to a Mr. Hayes. But this is just the start. These detailed rentals and surveys give a snapshot of the whole manor all at once. And where they're produced at intervals of 1 or 2 generations, we're able to track those changes and what occurred between them. The second document here is a detailed rental of Lord Shaftesbury's manor of Wimborne St Giles. It gives the acreage and annual rents for leasing his arable, pasture, meadow, coppices, mill and warren. It gives the size of the tenants' holdings and the rents that they paid. Because this is part of a series of rentals, we can examine the others to see when the warrens cease to be profitable and when the tenant numbers decline as the holdings gradually merged together. On other manors in Dorset and Wiltshire, we can see corn mills being converted into fulling mills and then returned to corn or abandoned as the cloth market changed. So we can see short and long-term economic trends playing out in individual manors over a period of decades or even centuries. Now, using some of these stewards' papers, surveys and maps, I want to look at two examples of how manorial documents have been used to examine areas of rural life and changes in the landscape. Instead of looking at the development of a community, these studies use manorial documents to contribute manorial to environmental research. First, look at Natural England and the Dorset Environmental Records Centre's study of ancient woodland. Natural England has project officers working with local groups to survey ancient woodland across the country. The task is to survey woodland that existed before 1600, and this classification is important for grant applications and for demonstrating longevity of vulnerable habitats that require protection. An initial assessment for Dorset was published in 1988 and relied upon key sources such as maps and place name evidence. Sometimes the earliest available maps were manorial maps, like this one of Bridestone, dated 1659, showing the extent of woodland well before the earliest Ordnance Survey or tithe maps. The Bridestone map, which happens to be one of the earliest examples of a map produced by a woman cartographer, shows not only 925 acres of Bradley Wood, but also several smaller pockets of woodland on the steep hills together with their acreages and in some cases the number of trees. And you can see this map at the moment in the British Library in their exhibition space. The Ancient Woodland Project officers were principally concerned with assessing and confirming the known evidence, the evidence from their 1988 survey, already on file, extracted from maps like this one and recording it onto a GIS system. However, there are lots of pieces of ancient woodland for which no evidence had been collected. They're not on areas that were covered by earlier maps, and project staff don't have the capacity to check against written records. And this is where local historians, working as volunteers, have the skills to confirm the existence of pieces of woodland that might not otherwise meet the threshold for classification as ancient woodland. This allows local historians to use their skills and add to the capacity of the project. By examining manorial court rolls, surveys, extents, presentments, accounts, stewards' papers and rentals, they can locate references to ancient woodland that would otherwise go unnoticed. This is also an opportunity for work experience students, often studying natural sciences, to engage with a range of records that they wouldn't previously have used. Records like these, relating to the wooded areas of the manors of Derwiston, Litchett Minster and Oakford Fitzpaine. These are papers containing court roll extracts, surveys and accounts produced by the steward of the Lord of the Manor, Sir Thomas Kitson. Now, Kitson was an absentee lord, really. He was a prominent courtier in the late Tudor court, and his family seat was in Suffolk, which is where these papers have ended up as part of the family collection deposited in the Suffolk County Archives. But his steward was quite keen to maximise the profit from the manors and kept meticulous notes in English so he could quickly access information without ploughing through the Latin court rolls. So these are summaries of transactions that were recorded in the court rolls, but the steward has extracted to keep in his papers as a quick reference. There's a lease of a 20-acre coppice wood called Sutcombe in Dorset. There's a coppice wood called Beerwood in Litchett Minster. And there's a sale of standing timber in 2 areas of Oakford-Fitzpaine. Now, most of these entries, and certainly the ones for Derweston and Litchett Minster, on their own, without any other supporting evidence, provide enough information for the surviving portions of these wooded areas to meet the classification of ancient woodland and therefore inclusion in the Natural England's Register. Now, Dorset Survey of Ancient Woodlands was only begun last year, so I haven't got any kind of final stats or analysis on it. But another project, managed by the National Trust, which made extensive use of manorial records, was completed in 2015. During the 1930s, Cyril Diver assembled a team of volunteers and experts who meticulously surveyed, mapped and recorded wildlife on the heath and sand dune system on the Studland Peninsula. It's near Poole in Dorset. 80 years later, the National Trust led a 3-year project to resurvey the peninsula. The work of Cyril Diver and his team was repeated, and the changes in the species of flora and fauna recorded. Here, Diver and his team are pictured on the heath and within the dune system, which are 2 of the key elements at Studland that make it a designated place of special scientific interest. To understand the changes that had taken place, why some species had become more numerous, some remained stable, others declined, it's necessary to note the changes to the landscape that had taken place both before and after the original project. Well, after the original project is fairly straightforward, but before the project, the changes to that area over the previous 200, 300, 400 years, that's more difficult to establish. So one of the first tasks was to establish the rate of environmental change, and particularly the rate of growth of the sand dune system. Here we see on Ralph Treswell's map, produced in 1585, alongside the 21st century LiDAR image, the same area. Both maps are Poole Bay. Poole Bay's to the bottom left of each map as you're looking at it. And at the top, it's facing towards the Isle of Wight into the open sea. Treswell's map's extraordinarily well surveyed and drawn. Particularly, we can see how the coastline facing into Poole Bay, that's towards the pair of compasses, bottom left, looks remarkably similar to the survey on the LiDAR image. Above this, we can see the LiDAR image has a large area of land that's shown as sea, open sea, on Treswell's map. These are the sand dunes that had hardly developed in 1565. The so-called Little Sea, which is in the centre of Treswell's map, is entirely open and tidal, whereas on the LiDAR survey, only a few black pools remain, separated from the sea by the dunes. On Treswell's map, we can identify certain key features of land, such as the salt pans bordering the Little Sea in the centre of the map and a small group of enclosed pastures at the bottom. Each different use of the land contributed to the soils that support the flora and fauna today. So it's important to know how the dune system developed the dune system developed almost entirely within the last 400 years. How it developed and the use of the land during that period is where the manorial documents really come into their own. 200 years elapsed between Treswell's survey of 1585 and the next survey by Woodward. And Woodward refers to Treswell's survey as the old survey. And his new survey is conducted in 1775. Between these dates, the stewards' papers, court rolls and rentals give details of how the land was managed. Details such as the number of animals that each tenant could graze on the heath, And it's only from a close reading of these manorial documents that a timeline can be established of how Studland Heath and Dune system were used and worked. We can already see in 1585 that the former salt pans were leased as closes. That's in the document on your left. And in the steward's papers, we can see that they were used as pasture. And at different times, we can see that they're used as pasture for different types of animals, which then contributes to the different qualities of the soil. Partly this tells us about the soil build-up from those animals, but it also just gives us the important piece of information that they had ceased to be used for salt production, at least by this date, which is a particularly important piece of information regarding the soil quality. William Woodward's survey of the Manor of Studland, produced in 1775, also includes a map, but it's his written survey that provides the most useful information. The heath covered 1,200 acres, and intermixed with it were a further 1,000 acres of waste. Woodward states that the waste was, and I quote, mostly consisting of sandbanks, flats, and mud, many hundreds of acres of which have been left by the sea and become heath ground since the old survey was taken. That part of the waste, called the Little Sea, is yearly growing into heath and will become heath within a few years. So we have a chronology, we have a description of how that land has changed within the relatively recent past and how it is continuing to change at the time that the survey is taken. Now, neither the ancient woodland nor the Cyril Diver project set out to use manorial documents. They'd have been equally happy to access information from parish records or local government records. But it's the manorial documents that were the most useful to them. So as we've seen, manorial documents survive in surprisingly large numbers, and they can answer lots of questions on a wide range of different projects. And they're now easy to locate as the National Archives has completed the manorial documents register. If Dorset is representative, you'll find that around half of a manor's records are in the local county archive. Up to another quarter in the archives of other counties, and particularly adjacent counties, with up to another quarter being accessible in the National Archives, the British Library, and various schools and colleges, and only a relatively small number are still held in private collections. And many of these may be accessible by arrangement. So if you're lucky, you might come across a document like the charts that plot the rotation of reeves and tithing men at White Regis in Dorset in the 17th century. Important information to see who held these offices, how they held them, what property qualification there was for somebody to hold the office of reeve, working on behalf of the Lord of the Manor, working to administer his estate, or tithing man, working on behalf of the courtly, upholding local bylaws, weights and measures, etc. I was particularly lucky yesterday in the British Library where I was looking through a set of Manor Court records and happened to stumble across half a dozen women being elected as tithing men, or tithing women in this case, in the late 16th century on a manor near Chippenham. Now, this isn't supposed to happen, but this sort of thing does happen. Occasionally, when you're looking through Manor Court records, you're looking for something else, you're not really intending to find information on maybe manorial officers, but it springs out. It's that sort of serendipitous thing that you can find information about all kinds of different subjects. Now, these women were elected as officers or selected as officers because they had a particular property holding. It was their turn in the rotation. As the wheel turned around, their property came up as being the one where the officer should be provided. We might expect, well, okay, they're women who are being elected, maybe they're providing a surrogate, maybe they can't actually do the job, maybe the court isn't going to allow them to do it. but in fact they come to the next court and make their presentment as tithing women. It's not supposed to happen like that. If you look in the steward's manuals of the 17th century, you know, they wouldn't accept that women could undertake these offices. But sometimes these local customs, these local anomalies just develop organically, and sometimes you find particular pieces of information that you're not expecting to find. So these documents may show both archaic and current customs, the terms by which tenants held their land, the formation of the landscape, the management of fields, woodlands and meadows. They add biographical information to tenants who served as officers and those who appear in the presentments. They give information about crime and punishment and the regulations that prevented conflict. All the people are represented, from the families who entered the workhouse, to the small farmers, to the local elites. So in conclusion, for local historians, looking at both urban and rural areas, from the 16th century to the early 20th century, perhaps now is the time to ask, at the start of every project, no matter what the time period or the theme, what manorial documents are available and how might they be applied to our research? Thank you. Questions? Yes, happy to take questions. If anybody has a question. I'll have to wait for a microphone. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Mark, this is a question right from the beginning of your talk. You said that the youngest son was going to inherit. What happened to the other children? What the older sons? Did they not get an inheritance at all?
They don't get to inherit that piece of land. Now,
they might already have had a piece of land somewhere else.
Yeah, if the parents have acquired other land that's held under different conditions, maybe they have a bit of rental land, they can pass that on. But the copyhold agreement states that that block of land, that tenement of land, has to pass to the youngest son. It's something that seems quite common in Sussex, North Surrey, areas of Fenland around Somerset, and I think it's to do with those areas that in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, there was a large amount of open land, and land that could be taken in. So the eldest children had the opportunity to go out and make their own living, as it were, and the youngest children needed the support of the established thing. So and it then persists in some areas. But, yeah.
So the daughters just had to marry somebody with land?
Sorry?
The daughters had to marry somebody?
Daughters had to marry someone, yeah. They don't get to inherit land, unless there are no sons. But it's could be held tenure. You can pass it to daughters. If you have no sons, it descends to your daughters. And then the custom may be the eldest or the youngest or partible inheritance, and it depends on the custom of the manor. Could be any of them. You could always ask me questions later if you...
Hi, thank you, Mark. Excellent talk. Could you just clarify some of the roles of the people within the manors? Does it depend on which court? Like, what's the difference between the homage and the jurors, reeve and steward? Does it depend which type of court it is, or what's the difference?
Yeah, the court baron and the court leet both appoint juries. The jury at the court baron, the Lord's Court, has to come from among his copyhold tenants, and the court leet has a wider group of people from freehold tenants and other people who are obliged to attend. So the court leet has a larger pool of people to select from, and there are a large group of people who it can select. The other officers, sometimes it's on a property qualifications. Sometimes there are officers like the assessors of fines, the people who set the level of fines within the court, who are the sort of top jurors, the foreman of the jury. The Reeves and the Haywoods are usually people who have significant agricultural holdings, always customary tenants, usually not leaseholders or freeholders, and they are selected on rotation. Some officers might be salaried. I think that constables and Reeves in areas where the job is quite onerous can receive remuneration for it. So there's a whole different range, and it depends on the court, and it depends on the size of the area of jurisdiction, both how many officers are required and how those officers are selected, but frequently by rotation.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, the difference between the homage and the jurors?
Difference between homage and jurors.
At the beginning of each court.
Yeah, the homage will be at the court baron. So the homage is at the Lord's Court. They are homagers. They are people who have sworn a kind of feudal allegiance to the Lord of the Manor. Whereas the jurors are people who are obliged to attend the court as inhabitants of the area.
Thank you.
Oh.
Yes, thank you very much. Is this on? Yes. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, and it's clarified a number of issues for me. But I wonder if you could explain a little bit more about the relationship between the baronial courts and parish vestries. And the reason I ask this is that I come from a parish in North London, Hornsey, which enclosed two very distinct manors. And on numerous incidents, looking through the records there, the vestry seemed to be appointing officers, which one would assume were normally the responsibility of the one or other of the manors. And so it seems to me it must have been a very complex relationship between the vestry and those two independent manors.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that's unusual. I think there's often a complex relationship between the vestry and manors. Everything's much simpler if you have one parish manors, but frequently, probably usually you don't. Frequently there are several manors that occupy the same parish and spill over into adjacent parishes. There's the sort of theory and legislation from the Tudor period onwards about who should appoint particular officers, but in practice you find that local custom and local precedent tends to take over. So you can have highways officers and you can have other constables being appointed at either, and it really depends on the power and the authority of the local organisation. If the manorial court has retained its authority, then it may well be appointing those officers rather than the parish vestry, but over time it's quite likely that the parish vestry will take over. I mean, if we look at the period from 1550 through to 1920, whatever's happening in 1550, 1600, 1650 may well change by the time we get into the 19th century. So it's quite likely that the Manor Court will start off being the more powerful organisation and the one at which those officers are appointed in the 16th and 17th centuries, and then that will change and it will flip as the Manor Court becomes less significant. And that's a really interesting process. And that's one of the reasons why the manorial documents and the manorial history is so interesting, that relationship between the manor and the parish is constantly changing over 400 years, and plotting that change and charting that change, seeing when it takes place, why it takes place, does it take place at the same time as adjacent parishes? Really interesting. Thank you.
Hello, I'm studying responding in Derbyshire, and you mentioned the surveys in the Manor Court. Is there any specific methodology where you can use these surveys to transform them into a map?
Yeah. I mean, there would have been a methodology for transforming surveys into a map in the 16th and 17th, the late 16th and 17th century. But
From
today,
from now,
not that I'm aware of, there are plenty of examples where this has been done. I'm thinking about June Palmer's book 3 Tudor Surveys, which was published by the Dorset Record Society, but that's because I'm a Dorset person and I happen to know that one. But I'm sure there are plenty of others. And certainly what June did was she took a map that was an estate map from the 18th century and surveys from the 1580s. And she found that by taking the fixed points in the surveys and by looking at the size of the holdings, both in the survey and in the estate map, that she was able to plot quite accurately different, more or less all the holdings in the 1580s onto estate map, which I think was from the 1750s. It's a very good piece of work, but I'm sure that's been replicated in other places. So if you're talking about taking surveys now and how to plot them out, then I mean I would say that's not a bad place to start.
I've got some, so that's what I'd like to do.
Yeah, sure, it's possible.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Mark. It's me at the back.
Oh.
Hi, Mark. I've got some questions from the chat online, which I'm going to read to you now, if that's okay.
Okay.
So we've got people asking questions. So, first question, what advice would you give to those of us who want to access documents in Latin but have not yet acquired the relevant skills? I think there's several of us who'd like to. How long have you got?
Well, assuming that you've already booked into a day school at Keele or a kind of one of their week-long courses or somewhere where it's possible for people to learn Latin for local historians, and that you've already picked up a copy of Eileen Goodall's Latin for local historians, assuming that that's the case. And so you're looking at manorial documents, but you haven't yet got the level of Latin to do it. Well, what I do, I think, is start in the 1650s. I think if you start in the 1650s, then the handwriting's difficult, but not too difficult. If you can read a parish register from the 1650s, you can read a manorial document from the 1650s. And it will give you the whole range of activities of the court. So 1650s, a lot of manor courts are still very active, and they're still carrying out the full range of actions and activities that you would find a century earlier. So you can look at documents from the 1650s in English. All these documents produced during the Commonwealth are in English. And so you can get a head start on finding out how the court works and get a good decade's worth of information. And I mean, for a lot of studies, a decade's worth of information will take a lot of time to establish. But it will give the roles of the officers, it'll give some of the technical proceedings, some of the technical terminology that you need to then carry through to other documents.
Great. I should also be cheeky. Conflict of interest here, but I should declare that the National Archives has an award-winning, wonderful online Latin training.
Oh, sorry, no, online.
Right, next question, Mark. May have missed this, but you divide urban and rural manors, where many manors were mixed between urban and rural. So will the County Record Office here in Cheshire let the inquirer know which is my manor in Warrington?
Sorry, I didn't catch the first bit of that.
But you mentioned that that you divided between urban and rural manors. And there were many mixed manors between urban and rural. So the question really is, so will the Cheshire Record Office be able to tell the inquirer which manor is in Warrington, which manor it is that they want?
Oh, the manorial documents register online ought to tell you that. If you know the parish, if you know the ancient parish, then you ought to be able to find out which manor is within each parish through the manorial documents register online. I'm sure Cheshire Record Office will be able to help you as well, but to save using somebody in the middle to do that, then the manorial documents register online will tell you all the manors within each parish, whether or not any manorial documents survive for them.
Okay, and one final question, I think. So, was the legal process the same for all English places in this era, or was North and South different? And I guess also you can include Wales in that too, couldn't you? Same question.
So again,
Was the legal process the same for all English places in this era, or was North and South different?
Where manors are holding a court baron, and that court baron is a customary court, it depends on the custom of the manor, and that custom will depend on the manor itself. There isn't a north-south divide for that. There is a divide in Wales, because the Statute of English Laws that's brought in 1540-something, I'm thinking possibly 1543, but I'm not quite sure, determines that all courts that have previously been following Welsh practices have to adhere to English laws. So there is there's a distinction in Wales, but in northern and southern England, I'm not aware of any distinction, but for me, the north starts at Chippenham in Wiltshire.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I think I will draw some up. This is Paul Driver, by the way. I'm the acting chair at the moment. I'm online live in the room. We've had lots of comments to you, Mark, online that you can't see, but you'll see shortly. Thanking you for a great talk and asking other interesting questions. I should say to everybody online and in the hall that you can buy Mark's wonderful new book on post-medieval manorial records, which he co-edited with Helen Watt. Many people are holding those up in the room. You can buy that if you're in the hall from our bookstall today, or you can buy it online from the association's website. Although obviously Mark won't be able to sign necessarily your online copies. Although I'm sure he will if you ask him nicely. We're now going to move in the hall to a short break, and I think for those of you online, you will have the choice between continuing to hear from Mark and joining us for our annual general meeting, which starts in about 5 minutes. So many thanks everyone, and thanks to Mark.